doing?
Well, today Mr. Wang taught us about genetic screening, and it was really interesting, but I kind of don't understand it.
Is it because you and Kira and Shivdeep and Kamaldeep, and your ringleader Jasmine keep on talking during class time?
No, Mom, that's not the reason. And Mr. Wang knows that we're good students now.
Okay, well then let me try and help you. So what specifically do you have questions on?
Well, like the whole technology thing, the history and pros and cons, as well as like how genetic screening was generally conducted.
Okay, that actually doesn't sound that bad, so I'll be glad to help you. How about you tell me what you learned in class?
Let's start with what I learned today in class. So I learned that it's a systematic search system, and also that for people that have certain genotypes, genetic screening is performed to test on individuals and to see whether or not, like, if those traits were passed on to their ancestors through generations and generations. And basically, now, could you explain to me about the whole technology thing?
Yeah, of course I can. So basically, as you know, technology has advanced in the medical sector over the years. However, genetic screening is something that really stands out because it's one of the most useful in detecting your traits and your diseases as well. So say back in BC 200, we didn't exactly have genetic screening, so they couldn't test for genetic disorders or anything like that. But now in 2016, or even starting from around in the late 1970s, all of that was possible. So basically, genetic screening is actually a type of medical test which identifies changes in your chromosomes, in your genes, and in your proteins as well. And it also helps to identify if individuals are at a risk of obtaining genetic disorders, passing them on to their family members, or if they simply might be at a risk of getting it from somewhere else as well.
Oh yeah, that seems really familiar. But now the history thing is a little confusing. Could you explain to me about, in 1961, I know that there was a scientist named something, I forgot. But could you explain to me about the whole, what happened then?
Sure, so of course you are right. So basically in 1961, a scientist by the name of Robert Guthrie developed a method to test newborns for a metabolic defect known as phenylketonuria. So basically this was the first screening done to test for a metabolic defect in newborns. However, Robert Guthrie also discovered a blood test for detecting PKU in newborns in the 1960s, and at that time he didn't know that it would have such a big impact. But 50 years later, it's helped so many families and so many newborns as well. So does that make sense so far?
Yep, it does. And also, I know that in 1970, genetic screening became more popular as the trend increased. As well as now, there's been two diseases, mainly PKU, phenylketonuria, which we were talking about before, and the sickle cell disease.
Yeah.
And this trend increased through 1970 over 12 states.
Yeah, exactly. So you are on the right track, but also even after several years, say in 2008, right? Technology advanced and DNA-basis tests were actually pitched to consumers. So individuals could actually submit a sample of their saliva, and this would go to the lab and they would be able to learn about their risk of developing these genetic diseases. So does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does.
So let me tell you how exactly genetic screening takes place. So basically what happens is that an individual needs to go over to a doctor, right? And a DNA sample needs to be taken. So now the DNA sample can be something like a tissue sample. So for example, when doctors swab the inside of your cheek, they get your cheek cell samples, right? So that's like a DNA sample. And basically that is then sent to a laboratory, and the laboratories then, they look at your chromosomes and your DNA and your proteins, and they see and they test you either positive or negative for the genetic disorders that you might be at a risk of developing or then passing on as well.
Okay, that makes sense. And I also learned that most scientists are able to manipulate the structure of a gene. So here would be our chromosome.
Yeah.
And also that through the early 1970s, there was this process called gene splicing. And basically, splicing, splicing the term when you cut something?
Yeah.
Exactly, that's the same thing. In 1970s, they talked about how this process included the cutting of a sequence of chromosomes and DNA, and that this process included the cutting of a sequence of genomes with restriction enzymes, which I learned in class recently today, and that proteins act like molecular scissors that cut the ends of these DNA strands and bind it.
So now that you know exactly how genetic screening is conducted, are you aware of the advantages that it has?
Actually, yeah, I am. Some advantages for genetic screening is that with a diagnosis that can be made on a suspect fetus, so like basically those test tube babies or in vitro fertilization, how they take those like little samples and put them in the test tube.
Yeah.
Those they can allow individuals then to test it on them and see if there's any problems or genetic traits that occur, and then make decisions about the further future treatments. Furthermore, individuals carrying harmful genetic alterations can receive regular medical checkups, as well as, moreover, early screening can be done to detect cancer for individuals or that have a strong history for cancer traits. This allows an individual to undergo preventative surgery to further reduce cancer incidence and mortality.
But you do know that where there's advantages, there are also disadvantages.
Unfortunately, yes, that's true.
Exactly. So some disadvantages of genetic screening is that basically before prenatal screening was used to actually look at disorder and see if they could prevent those disorders from occurring, but now it's mainly just used for desired traits. Also, genetic screening actually costs a lot of money, and most families don't have that money, so they never know what they are at a risk of developing in terms of genetic disorders. And many individuals also receive a lot of stress, whether it's traumatic stress or even emotional stress, and this can lead to them making very harmful choices in life.
Exactly. Wow, I learned so much today. Thanks, Mom. Now I can tell Mr. Wang and all my classmates about what I learned.
I'm glad you learned a lot, Joy.